Hello and welcome to How to Play Demolition in the Red Solstice. First things first, let's talk about why Demo is one of my favorite classes and which capability he has that other classes lack. Number 1, Demo is the only class that can craft explosives, which means he can provide vast amounts of explosives for the whole team. Number 2, Demo is also the only class that can craft seismic resonators. This is especially useful when playing hardcore mode, where you have whole waves of burrowed units coming towards you and your team. Number 3, it's also the only class that can disarm explosives, nukes, and turrets without having to rely on disarm tools. Demo is also the only class that has an ability which enhances the damage of the law. There are various other reasons and things that make Demo class special and unique, but to get a short overview of the class, I think that should be enough. For now, let me show you two different builds I like to roll on and how to use them later on in the game session. So first off, let me show you the speed build. It revolves around a high movement speed. This is accomplished by rolling with a light primary weapon such as the SMG and 3 movement speed boosters, which means he will have a negative armor resistance, but that does not matter that much because he can basically outrun most mobs and that way prevent from getting any damage anyways. When talking about the components, I like to use the rocket amplifier module just because it has some nice burst damage, and also on level 4 it enables you to launch the cluster rocket, which is pretty useful as you see later on. Then I'd like to use the stationary explosive module because it enables you to craft explosives, claymores and chain explosives, which is pretty useful in the late game. Also level 5 means that you can place a detonator on top of your chains, and it also protects, on level 3 it protects your explosives from your teammates, so only you can detonate them and not some random player with an autocannon or you know, some skill can blow up your explosives when you don't really want them to be blown up. Then I'll be rolling with a seismic resonator device, which is awesome when you want to fight against burrowed units. You could, however, replace this with sentry drone device if you plan on having a more stationary game where you're bunkering down early on, or directional primer charge, which is nice if you plan to solo a lot and run around a lot, and also when you want to clear out the immortals in the late games. The nice big AoE of it means that you can basically get rid of a lot of small mobs in just a second. And last but not least, the mechanic system, which is pretty awesome because it reduces your skill cooldowns by a really nice amount, which is especially useful when you're disarming turrets, and also gives an aura which reduces your teammates' skill cooldowns, which is a nice benefit. As secondary, some people like to use the FAS for speed build, but I like to use the M1GL simply because it's always nice to have another detonator for your explosives, another explosive source that can blow up your stacks that you plant, especially in the late game when you're running low on sats. Having a M1GL is nice because cooldown is rather low and there are more than enough grenades to blow up your stacks of chains and plasmas and whatever. So let's come to the second build. It revolves a bit more around higher base damage. and this is accomplished by using 2 ammunition boosters, and I'm also using an energy booster just because that extra skill point is very useful in the late game. I'm still using the stationary explosive module. As I mentioned, I think it's really necessary for a serious demo. Also using the rocket amplifier module again. However, this time I gain an even bigger benefit out of it because I'm using the law as a secondary. This means, however, that my base movement speed is a bit slower, but it's still fast enough to keep up with the team. And because I'm using rocket amplifier module and law, this means I can basically instantly take out a higher number of high value targets such as slashers, devourers, or hatchlings in the late game. I'm also taking the guard just because it has a nice good flat base damage, and I'm using FMJ also because in the late game FMJ is just so much more powerful than Hollow Point. Basically the only target that takes more damage from Hollow Point in the late game than from Full Metal Jackets that are hatchlings, yeah. I'm also rolling with crit to further increase my base damage. This also means that I have higher capabilities of staying alive alone, and also when I'm with the team I can just deal out so much more base damage, and as I said, high base damage is equal to high reliability. I'm also using directional primer charges just because they're awesome to take out those small mobs in the late game, especially the mobs that respawn if you don't blow them up. For example, Lizarians have a pretty high chance to respawn, and Immortals, and basically with one directional primer charge I'm able to take out multiple of those targets, where I'd usually would have to plant claymores on their body, or at least the team would need a medic with chem bomb to take care of the bodies. But with a directional primer charge there is no need for chem bomb. Chem bomb is still a big benefit, but yeah, directional primer charge is just an awesome skill for this. So yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Gameplay wise, I'd like to start out with some basic knowledge about explosives, and that would be, first off, how to craft them. To craft them you need the stationary explosives module. To craft a claymore, for example, you need to put 1 point into stationary explosive module, click the skill, and then you can disarm it right away, so you can stack up on clays. As soon as you put 2 points into stationary explosive module, you'll be able to craft a chain explosive. And if you disarm it again, you can again stack up to 100 of chain explosives. Chain explosives and claymores are the only explosives that can be crafted by the demo and also disarmed again to be stacked up to a high number. The demo class is also capable of crafting directional primer charges, however it cannot disarm those. The same goes for seismic resonators. The way those explosives are triggered may vary from explosive to explosive. Claymores, for example, are triggered by anything hostile that enters the claymore radius. It's actually a bit smaller than the triggering radius is actually a bit smaller than the radius that is shown, but it's still big enough to be triggered by most of the creeps that walk through it. Chain explosives do not have a built-in detonator. As the name suggests, they are triggered by a chain reaction. That means you need another explosive source to blow them up and trigger the explosion. In this particular instance, I'm using the M1GL grenade launcher to blow up the chain explosive. However, if you put 5 points into stationary explosive module, you will be able to plant a detonator on top of a chain explosives, which then can be detonated by selecting the explosive and pressing G. Another really valuable type of explosives are satchels. They have a built-in detonator and can be blown up by using the G button as soon as they're planted. This makes them extremely valuable for the late game when you need a bunch of detonators. It's recommended not to waste satchel charges to blow up targets, but just use one single satchel charge to trigger a chain reaction. So satchels are somewhat similar to chain explosives with a detonator on top, but they deal a bit less damage. Next up, directional primer charges. If you plant a directional primer charge, you'll see a cone, and basically as soon as you blow up the directional primer charge, it will trigger an explosive wave heading in the direction of the cone. This is perfect to take out multiple light targets. One of the bit more powerful explosives are plasma explosives. They do not have a built-in detonator. However, they deal a partial amount of energy damage to a target, which might be useful, and they also slow down any target that is not killed by them. However, since you can only stack up to 4 of them, I tend to use them early on and to get the free inventory slot back so I can keep other valuable items. Explosive bunks have the highest amount of firepower, so to say, of the explosives. However, you can only stack up to 8 of them. They do not have a built-in trigger, and they also have the biggest AoE. So I like to use them to blow up bosses like Thanatos that are extremely fast moving, especially when you're in a laggy game. The big AoE is a big advantage, but if there are other items around and if I have enough other explosives, I will probably use them rather quickly, so again I'll have some more free inventory slots. I prefer blowing up the directional primer charges manually. However, I've seen a lot of people using claymores as a trigger for the directional primer charges, and in some situations this might not be a bad idea, so keep in mind that you can either use sats or also claymores, which trigger by themselves as soon as an enemy walks across them, to trigger any type of other explosive. Then we have incendiaries, which basically trigger a fire as soon as they're blown up. However, I've seen a lot of people place them wrong. People tend to think that the fire damage actually stacks, but in this little example or little experiment I'll show you right away, you'll see that the fire damage does not stack. The fire damage does only occur inside of the AoE circle radius you'll see when you're planting them. And basically in this experiment I have 3 incendiaries stacked next or almost on top of each other on the left side and only one on the right side. We used my friend Magnum, who's a game dev, actually helped me out with this, and used God mode for this experiment. And basically, he will trigger 2 slashers at the same time, one standing on the 3 incendiaries on the left and one on the 1 incendiary on the right. And you will probably notice really quickly that they both take the same amount of damage, and they will both die after the same period of time. And that means that if you're stacking incendiaries on each other, you only gain a boost of initial damage, but the fire damage over time does not stack. By simulating the monster's movement, you can figure out the right positions to plant incendiaries. If you plant them and you want to plant them properly, you should make sure that the radiuses of them do not overlap or only slightly overlap to get the maximum out of each incendiary. The best way to trigger incendiaries, if they're planted in a line, is to use a directional primer charge. However, if you do not have a directional primer charge, you may use any other explosive as detonator. While blockers and most flesh targets take high amounts of fire damage, a lot of armored dogs such as slashers and devos only take an insignificant amount of damage. Plasma fires are similar to incendiaries, but their value is a lot higher since the damage per tick is also a lot higher. In this experiment, I'll show that plasma fires do not stack with each other, but plasma fires do stack with incendiaries. So on the left side I have incendiaries and plasma fires, and on the right side I stacked 2 plasma fires. And as you can see, on the left side the slasher died a bit faster. This means, especially since the plasma fires have such a high value, do not place 2 on top of each other because that would be a waste. A very underrated skill is the Demo's Disarm Skill. It can be used to disarm multiple things. The disarm ability also gets enhanced by stationary explosive module. That means if you have stationary explosives module level 0, you won't be able to disarm claymores or chains, but you'll be able to disarm a seismic resonator. If you put 1 skill point into stationary explosives module, you'll be able to disarm claymores. That's exactly the same level you need to plant a claymore. So, as you can guess, if you put 2 points into stationary explosives module, you'll be able to disarm chain explosives. You cannot disarm chain explosives with a detonator planted on top. We will say invalid target. For disarming incendiary explosives, you need stationary explosive level 4. You can also not disarm explosive bunks. You can disarm satchel charges, but you need stationary explosives level 5 for that. And you can also not disarm plasma explosives or plasma fires at all. They are invalid targets. You can also disarm turrets, and for that you also need stationary explosives level 5, but keep in mind disarming turrets has a very high cooldown, so you might want to put the rest of the points into mechanic skill systems if you have it. So one of the techniques I'd like to show you today is rounding, or rather how to round up mobs. That's mostly going to be Behemoths and Liganesh when you have a Behemoth and Liganesh wave. It's pretty simple to do that. You just gotta make sure that the Behemoths are pretty close to each other, so have your teammates first off come to you if they're followed by a Behemoth, and as soon as the Behemoths are close enough to you, send your teammates away so the Behemoths solely focus on you. You gotta know about the game mechanics, that basically the aggro system works like this, that the monsters will always at first try to attack the target that's closest to them. So make sure you're closest to the Behemoths, and then you can either walk from one side of the road to the other side of the road and just keep going. Then they'll slowly clump up and be on one spot, or you just can do it a little faster by walking in circles around them. As soon as you've done that, they're perfectly arranged on one spot, so you can blow all of them up with just one stack of explosives. That way you waste way less explosives, since you don't have to blow them up one by one, which is just awesome. Positioning yourself is essential to playing a good demo. If you're standing on the wrong spot at the wrong moment, you might lure the mobs away from the explosives, and thereby your explosives will not hit with full power, and the boss, for example the Hellspawn, might survive and your whole team might die because of that mistake. So once you found a nice spot to plant your explosives, also make sure you're standing in the right position when the boss or the mob you're trying to blow up is approaching. Also try to signal your team to stand in the right position if they're new to the game. And if something happens and the trap misses, you should be able to react fast and replant a stack of explosives as fast as possible. Having an extra stack of explosives as failsafe is never a bad thing to do, so if you have more than enough explosives, just plant an additional stack to be sure to kill the boss. So, as you can imagine, blowing up bosses is extremely complicated, because you actually have to select your explosive stack, plant it, and then blow it up. Drillers and some other units are capable of destroying your explosives and thereby blowing them up. If you don't want them to be blown up, you should put 3 points into stationary explosives module. This will prevent friendly fire from blowing up your explosives, and also will prevent most of the units from blowing up your explosives, thereby preventing any damage to your teams which could have been induced by your explosives. If you're using the cluster rocket ability, take note that you'll only deal damage in the red circle AoE. Initial damage, that is. After launching the rocket, after it hits, it will spawn a few cluster mines, and those cluster mines are actually claymores. They will take a few seconds to be armed. You can skip this delay that it takes for the claymores to be armed by using a grenade launcher or just launching a normal grenade. That way you get both the damage of the initial damage of the cluster rocket and the damage of the claymores. And because the cluster mines are actually claymores, you can also use that to your advantage simply by disarming them. Often it's a better idea to disarm the claymores that spawn from a cluster rocket than actually launching it somewhere to protect the area or something similar to deal damage. You'll often have more of the damage if you just disarm the cluster mines. Also, when planting turrets, make sure to not plant them in the direct path of the monsters. It will get destroyed. Rather, for example, if you're going to stand in the alley in this clip, I planted the turrets on the building next to the alley. That way they're not targetable, or rather the creeps will not attack them if they're standing that high or far away, rather. Also, thanks for watching. This should pretty much be a good introduction to some basic demo knowledge. There's still a lot more to learn. If you want, I'll upload another video sometime soon. Also, I'd like to explain why it was necessary for me to have Magnum help me out. Some scenes just required to have dev abilities. For example, the example with the slashers, you can't just tank a slasher forever. And I don't really have that much time to be recording all this, so I kind of asked Magnum out because I know we have history, and I also know he wouldn't allow abusing the dev abilities, so he just helped me out with a few scenes. And yeah, that was pretty much it. I didn't gain anything from it. I gained just a little bit XP from it, but let's say if instead of making the video, if I would have just kept playing normal games, I probably would have gained 50 times as much XP or so. So yeah. We just, of course, sometimes you'll use the game dev powers, or Magnum rather. I can use them. Apparently, Magnum will use them just to mess around a bit. For example, for the scene in the beginning, of course, you can't get that many turrets in a normal game, but it was just kind of to have a flashy entrance to the video. So, again, guys, I hope this explains it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.